Hey, what can you do with 16K? That's the question a lot of people were asking in the early 80s. The original ZX Spectrum came in two flavours, the full-fat, full-strength 48K model, brimming with musty vigour, and the slimmer, lighter, more delicately spiced 16K. And yes, okay, they were absolutely identical in every way apart from the memory and the price, the 16K being 50 quid cheaper. It didn't take long before it became apparent that the 48K was the only way to go though. If you wanted to play Manic Miner or Night Lore, that's what you needed, but for a while the 16K was a fairly popular choice, even if it was already dead by the time Zig Sputnik were firing their love missiles. So I'm going to take a look at a few of the games that managed to get the best out of this weakest of Spectrums and see just how well it all came out. Jetpac is where we have to begin, I think, from the now legendary Ultimate Play the Game, the software label from the Stamper Brothers before they founded the even more legendary Rare. This wasn't actually their first game, but it was their first home computer release, and it did quite well. Yes, it sold 300,000 copies at a time when there were still only 1 million Spectrums in existence, helped along no doubt by the fact that it was fully compatible with both models available. To some, it might not have been immediately obvious that the Spectrum was suited for games, especially the 16K model. It didn't quite have the built-in abilities of the C64, for example, released the same year. But hey, if the ZX81 could play games, then so could the Speccy, and Jetpac helped seal the deal, I'm sure. A pretty fabulous arcade shooter is this game. It didn't have a lot of depth, but it was an original that played about as well as anything you would find on a home system at that time. Simple, yes, but they all were back then. So how does this push limits? Well, if you've played many of the other 16K Speccy games from this era, it's not that hard to see. This is a fast-paced game that really moves well. Most of the moving objects are animated at 25 frames per second. Good for the era. The 16K's lack of memory was even more of a disadvantage than it might at first seem. It had knock-on effects in all sorts of ways, but of course, just lack of space was the biggest one. That 16K includes the video memory where the graphics are stored. After you've taken that away, you're only left with about 9 kilobytes of free space. Enough for some games, but only just. It gets even worse from there, I'm afraid, but let's just marvel at the efficiency of Jetpac for the time being. It's a cracker crammed into a tiny space. And hey, whilst you contemplate Jetpac, if you like this video, could I ask you to maybe hit that like button and also subscribe too if you haven't already? It helps me out a lot. Where to next? Well, how about Deathchase, or 3D Deathchase, or Deathchase 3D? It was known under various names, but whatever you want to call it, it's an undeniable classic. Owning a 16K machine back then meant that you might have missed out on a lot that was 48K only, but you did get this. A game that is, by some reckonings, the best ever on the Speccy. I'm not sure about that, but well, it's up there, isn't it? And actually, it's aged quite well compared to many of its contemporaries. A top 10 title, let's call it that. Like Jetpac, this is a fairly simple arcade-style game with no complex mechanics and no real narrative, apart from the blurb in the inlay, but what it does very well. Games like Battlezone might have been an influence, but this is an awful lot faster, and well, I would say quite a lot more fun. The enemies don't shoot back, your only foe is inertia, and it's all about avoiding those tree trunks and blasting away as fast as possible. Yes, okay, it's a little bit jerky, but hey, it's not bad, and it's hard to put a number on the frame rate because of the way the screen is updated. There's something happening in every frame, but it's not all happening at the same time. It does move at a fair old clip though, and speed was anything but a given on the 16K Spectrum. You see, as well as a lack of space, there was also something else to contend with, and that was contended memory. Yes, the first 16K of RAM on all Spectrums was quite slow, it having to share access with the video circuitry, and on the 16K Spectrum, the first 16K of RAM is all there is. So even in the best of circumstances, this machine is not going to be able to work quite as fast as its larger stablemate that had a whole 32k bank of faster, uncontended memory to play with. That this game runs so well is a real tribute to coder Mervyn Escort, a Spectrum pioneer who seemed to disappear fairly quickly. The scaling of the trees is particularly impressive here. It really works well and at great speed. There are in fact multiple copies of the trees drawn at different sizes stored in the memory, which helps keep things moving fast. Yes, it's hard not to love Deathchase, and it's one that seems to be well remembered long after most games from this milieu have been utterly forgotten. A slice of brilliance from the early days of the Speccy, and well, it all goes a bit downhill from here because I don't think anything else on the 16K was quite this much fun. So next up, let's take a look at Cavern Fighter. From Bugbyte, a company with a big name for a while, they published Manic and they had a few 16k games on their roster, but this was by far the best. Now, there were only ever a very small number of scrolling shooters on the 16k, and I dare say all of them being clones of either Williams Defender or, like this one, Konami's Scramble. Most of them were utterly terrible, but this one is an exception, and it's a very convincing evocation of the formula. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it looks and plays as well as the much better known Penetrator, another Scramble knockoff that was 48k only. There are a couple of reasons why there are so few games of this type attempted on the 16k. One that I can't ignore is the fact that this type of game didn't really become essential until this machine was done, but also because the lack of memory made it much more difficult. Yes, more complex games require more complex code, which requires more space, that's true, but there is more to it than that. A very common technique on the 48k was to use a back buffer to help with drawing graphics. This was an area of memory that was set aside for the graphics to be assembled in before they were copied to the main graphics memory to be displayed. In effect, they were first drawn behind the scenes before all being sent to be displayed in one go. This technique had a few advantages. Number one, despite sounding more complicated, it actually often made things easier. The graphics memory on the Spectrum was notoriously weird in its layout, so drawing the graphics in a buffer before converting it to the right format was often the simplest thing to do. It also, and this is a big one, helped cut out screen tearing and flicker. If you just send graphics data to the screen willy-nilly, it's very easy to get things out of sync, and one frame of animation may be sent before the last one has finished drawing, which causes very noticeable glitches. Setting up a buffer is one of the easiest and most efficient ways of dealing with this, helping to assure that the timing is right. The trouble is, the 16k doesn't really have enough space to set up a buffer. There's barely enough memory for this sort of trickery in the 48k, let alone its idiot brother, so a lot of advanced graphics techniques are just off the table. So what's going on with Cavern Fighter then? How is it managing to bring a convincing scrolling shooter where others failed? Well, it keeps things simple and it doesn't get het up about flicker. It's running pretty quickly, 25 frames per second, but well, as you can see from this slow motion view, it's in fits and starts. The enemies and other objects take turns with the background to be drawn every other frame, so they both appear to jitter next to each other. And yes, especially here on this level, you can see some tearing in the form of those black gaps that appear. Still, it works pretty well, and I'm surprised this seems to have been so completely overlooked. I'm not entirely sure when it came out, but the magazine reviews date from 1984, so this might have seemed a little like yesterday's news by then. And so onto another game that might have suffered in the same way. It's Sir Lancelot. A Manic style platform game that does what many may have thought impossible, and that's fit into the tiny memory of the most amnesiac Spectrum. And yes, let's get this out the way before I go any further. This game does have a serious, well, crippling flaw. One of the greatest impediments I've ever seen in a game. Ever. It plays the death march when you die. Every single time. Unskippable and unspeakably annoying. Why? I don't know. No one knows. It was a different time and it makes no sense, so let's not dwell on it. Happily though, with a quick poke we can disable this feature for good and pretend it never happened. Definitely for the best, because the rest of this game is pretty amazingly good for a 16K game. Held back by all the junior Spectrum's flaws and yet somehow still blossoming. There's absolutely no hiding where this game's inspiration came from, of course. Manic Miner, but also the, at the time, newly released Jet Set Willy. In fact, this bird sprite seems to have been lifted from Willy's mansion directly. It lacks the surreal lunatic genius of Matt Smith's creations. There's just not the same variety of baddies and obstacles. No surprise given the lack of memory. It does though boast more rooms than Manic Miner and includes what at the time must have been a wild innovation, the ability to control the Good Sir in the air. This adds some challenges that wouldn't be possible in the world of Miner Willy and makes it feel a bit more modern too. Amazing that so much was crammed in here, and it runs very smoothly too, with no flicker or glitchiness, despite the obvious lack of a graphics buffer, something that both of Miner Willy's outings made use of. The frame rate is good too, most things animating at 20 or 25 frames per second. A bit of an underloved classic this one that probably just came out a bit too late. Had it appeared a year or two earlier, it might have had more of an impact, but popping up at the tail end of 1984 when the 16K seemed to be very much on the way out, well, it seems like the world had moved on. Surely there can't be many more games to talk about after this though, right? Well, yes, by 1985, the year this next game was released, the 16K was pretty much finished. Was this the last commercial game to hit store shelves? It might well be. From July of that year, it's Don't Panic. Words to live by, lifted from the works of Douglas Adams, and this is an appropriately space-themed game with a surreal twist. I suppose it's Jetpac meets Capcom's Sun with maybe a hint of Pac-Man, that would sort of cover it. Another arcade-style game with not a lot of depth, but some simple pick-up-and-play mechanics. Is it good? Well, it sort of is my mealy-mouthed conclusion. Does it look good for a 16K game? That it does indeed. The aim of the game is to blast a number of household objects of various kinds into a rocket of some sort with your laser. All the while being chased by an utterly relentless alien, always creeping in at the wrong moment like an annoying relative. Assemble enough crap in your rocket and it's off to the next level to do it all again with some slightly different tat. The sprite work alone sets this apart from nearly every other 16K game. The lurching alien is an unforgettable foe and it's got a comic flair that a lot of amateurish early Spectrum games lack. It's also, that true rarity, a horizontally scrolling game. Just about. When you look closely you'll see that the background platform only has 2 frames of animation, and even that's not done smoothly with a lot of tearing going on. But hey, even if it is a bit juddery, it still runs with more pace than many other Spectrum games, though nothing seems to animate at any more than 10 frames per second. Again, this game really came too late to make much of an impact. In 1983, it would have been a smash, I'm sure. Heck, with a little more refinement, this could be something as superb as Ultimate's 16K games. Alas, in 1985, no one really cared. I'm not sure when the 16K was actually discontinued. I can't find any specific information about that, but I would guess sometime around the release of the Spectrum Plus in 1984, which was very much 48K only. Whilst the 48K machine was supported long after it was superseded by the 128K, no one really felt the need to do so for the most modest of the line. So is this where the story ends? Not just yet, because old computers never die, do they? There's always someone who wants to make new software for them. So let's take a look at Mag the Magician. A very recent title from 2017, in fact. Yes, there was basically no commercial releases outside of type-in listings in magazines and self-published stuff for the 16K after 1986. But some have revived the system a bit in more recent years, along with the rest of the Sinclair lineup of course, though I must say only a bit. There's still not that many releases, but hey, this is a good one and it's only just 16K. How so? Well, this will only work on the 16K in the form of an Interface 2 cartridge. You can't load it from cassette. The Interface 2 was Sinclair's own very short-lived ROM cartridge format that saw just 10 releases in the early 80s before syncing without trace. These carts plugged into the Interface 2 add-on, which provided 2 joystick ports and a hole to plug in the new and expensive ROM cartridges. Yes, it turned the Spectrum into a console, and no one cared at all at the time. The carts were limited to 16K and cost way more than cassettes. But you did get the full 16K of space to use, so effectively you had another 7-ish kilobytes to play with, the cartridge occupying the same space in the memory as the basic ROM chip, leaving everything else untouched. So, Mag the Magician is the only game on this list to actually be 16K, and you know what, I think you can tell. The graphics look absolutely superb with a great deal of detail and variety, helped along I'm sure by the extra space. The game itself is pretty simple, it looks sort of Zelda-like, but it's much less involved, pretty diverting for a while though. And whilst I'm on the subject, I should also mention Dead Space from the same author, Radistan. Another cartridge game that takes advantage of the extra space allowed. Yes, it's a remake of the survival horror game of the same name, and like Mag the Magician, it looks and plays amazingly well. Only one game of the original Interface 2 cartridge lineup actually made use of all the space, and that was the disappointingly dull Zion Chess, so it's nice to see it done. Right though, I think it's time to ring the bell for last orders at the bar on this one though. The end, yes, for now. What have I missed? Loads of things as usual. Ultimate Play the Game were responsible for another 3 16K games after Jetpac, all of them wonderful of course. And, well, there's a few, not loads, but a few more modern releases I've left out, including some from Jonathan Caldwell, a big figure on the Speccy scene, including this very impressive 16K version of Jet Set Willy. But I think this has got to be the end for now, and I'll leave anything else for another video. Thank you, as always, to my very wonderful patrons. Your help is greatly appreciated. If you too would like to support me on Patreon and see your name up here, there's a link roundabout and below. And well, I'll see you next time folks. Thanks for watching.